Hi, welcome to today's video. My name is Paul. So this week I'm going to take a very brief look at choosing watercolor papers. This video is mainly for beginners, people who are new to watercolor, but it might be of some interest to somebody else. So papers, watercolor papers, there are a lot of different papers, lots of different manufacturers, different brands. This video, I'm not going to promote any particular brand. I don't have any connections to anybody. And I don't want to focus on one brand because different people watching this video are from different parts of the world. Not all brands are equally available worldwide. So I don't want to exclude people. So instead what I'll do is I give you some ideas about the different types of paper that are out there. And with that information, you can maybe make informed choices about what type of paper you need or you want to try. On screen, you can see just a tiny fraction of all the different papers that are available. So when you're getting started, the biggest problem then is just there's too much choice. It's a bit overwhelming. Where do you start? And some people ask the question, what's the best paper for me to use? That question is not entirely bad or wrong, but maybe you can reword the question a little bit to make it easier to answer. I think instead the question you want to ask is, what paper will help me achieve the style that I want to paint in? So, for example, on the left is a style of watercolor painting that goes back a few hundred years. Back in the days before photography, scientists, amateur and professional, would have discovered new flowers, new insects, new whatever. They wanted to record this. Really, the only option they had was to draw and paint what they saw. So they'd probably draw it with pencil and then color in, and some of that coloring may have been done with watercolor paint. Back in those days, I think they were less purist, so they wouldn't have just used watercolor. They probably mixed gouache and other things in there as well. But either way, it's a very detailed style of painting, very crisp lines, very distinct lines, very hard edges, lots of details. The paper that you would use to paint something like that is quite different to the paper that you would use to paint something like the image on the right, a more impressionistic painting. So anything that's more modernist, more impressionist, anything that's looser, you're going to use a different type of paper. And it really all comes down to the surface texture. But I guess for choosing papers, there are maybe 4 different things we can consider. So number 1 is the material. What's the paper actually made of? At this point, I should say, if you're painting with watercolor, I would definitely recommend using watercolor paper. It sounds obvious, but some people choose to use drawing paper or mixed media paper. If you want to experiment with those things, go for it. Try it. Who knows? Maybe you'll be happy with the results. But in general, if you're painting in watercolor, I would definitely recommend getting a watercolor paper. It just makes things a little bit, I was going to say easier, but maybe it makes it less difficult, if you like. Painting with watercolor can be difficult as it is. If you're using a paper that's not designed for watercolor, you're just making things even more difficult for yourself. I say some people want that. That's the route they want to go down. So, go for it. Otherwise, let's stick with watercolor paper. So watercolor paper, what's it made of? Most people agree that the best material for watercolor paper is cotton, 100% cotton paper. It works better with the watercolor paint. It has the right level of absorbency. It has a nice surface to work on. It's quite tough, so it can buckle, but not as much as a wood pulp paper might. It's a better paper to work on with watercolor. The next thing to consider is the weight or the thickness of the paper. Now, it's usually expressed as a weight rather than a thickness, but you get the idea. Paper and water, they don't really mix very well. If you soak a piece of paper and then let it dry, it'll probably buckle in unpredictable ways. The thicker the paper, in other words, the heavier the paper, the fewer problems you'll have with buckling. You could still have some, but not as many. So there's kind of a magic number, if you like. It's 300 grams per square meter, or 140 pounds. That number and above, you'll have fewer problems with buckling. If you get a lighter paper, a thinner paper, it is cheaper, but you will have problems with buckling. There are things that you can do to try and minimize those problems. Basically, you can stretch the paper. Now, stretching paper is not a complex thing to do, but it is a process. It takes a bit of time. You need a bit of space to do it in. It's a bit messy, and so on. So if you want to go down that road, there are many videos on YouTube showing you how to stretch paper. It is an option, but personally I go for the thicker paper, heavier paper, and then I don't have to worry about all those things. If you don't have a dedicated studio space, if you're sharing a house with people, with family, stretching paper is not the most practical thing to do. So I go for thicker, heavier paper, and then I don't need to worry about stretching. The next thing is perhaps the most important thing, and that's the texture of the paper. At this moment, I'll just say that there are sort of three broad groups. You can have quite a smooth paper, a very rough paper, or something in between. We'll come back to texture because it's worth explaining a bit more. The last thing then is sizing. So sizing is a kind of glue that they add to the paper. It strengthens the paper and it slightly reduces the absorbency of the paper, at least for a while. The absorbency of the paper is very important. So, the watercolor paint and the paper interact in a complex way, and part of that is to do with how absorbent the paper is. Does the liquid watercolor paint sit on the surface of the paper for a few seconds, a minute or two? How much time do you have to play with that paint, to move it around? That's all part of the painting process, and it is an important thing, and sizing comes into that. So sizing can be internal, external, maybe both. The internal sizing is when they're making the paper, when it's still a mushy pulp of water and different materials, they'll add the sizing at that point. So as the paper dries, put it in a mold, press it, and the sizing will be hopefully evenly distributed throughout the paper. A second approach is externally sized paper. So you make the paper, you press it in the mold, and then you apply the sizing to the surface. It has slightly different properties. So I said the sizing makes the paper slightly less absorbent. It's not waterproof, but it doesn't absorb the paint as quickly. So if the sizing is on the surface, it means your paint and your pigment will stay closer to the surface for a longer time. It won't sink into the paper just as much, and some people say that gives them brighter, more vivid colors, because more of the pigment is sitting closer to the surface of the paper. Whereas with the internally sized papers, the pigment sort of sinks in a little bit, gets mixed in with the fibers, and as the paint dries, it fades a little bit. You lose a little bit of that vibrancy. There are some other differences. If you like to sketch out your subject on the paper in pencil, you need to be careful with, especially with externally sized papers. If you erase part of that pencil work and you're a bit too vigorous when you're erasing the pencil marks, you can damage the sizing on the surface. That will affect, it will cause a localized effect, and it'll just make the painting process much more difficult. It'd be difficult to get uniform results. So sizing, it is important. The better manufacturers will tell you on their website whether the paper is internally or externally sized. A lot of other manufacturers don't. They keep it a secret for some reason. I don't know. I just ignore those brands and I go for the brands that tell me the information that I want to know. One final thing about sizing is some of it, a lot of it is animal based still. It's based on gelatin. So if you're vegan, or if you don't want to use products that are animal based as such, then sizing, you need to take that into account. Again, good brands will give you that information on their website. They'll tell you this is an animal based sizing or not. Some manufacturers like Sennelier do use animal based sizing as far as I know. Others, like the German company Hahnemühle that I use a lot, they stopped using animal-based sizing, I think back in the 1960s or 70s. So they use a plant-based or chemical-based sizing. So as I say, it's worth going back and taking a bit more time with paper texture, because that's an important part of watercolor painting, I think. So as I say, there are three basic groups or categories, if you like. On the left, we have hot press paper. This is quite a smooth paper. On the right, we have rough paper, which is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a rough surface. And then in between, we have cold pressed, which confusingly is also sometimes called not. This might be more of a British thing, I'm not sure, but some brands will describe their watercolor paper as not. It means cold press. So cold pressed has some surface texture. It's not rough, it's not smooth, somewhere in between. I should also say at this point that these are not scientific labels. So company A might have a hot press paper that is very smooth. Company B will have a hot press paper that's actually more like a cold press paper. Different brands use the names in different ways. So you've got to experiment. When you're getting started, okay, you can use some of this information to choose a paper, but there's also an element of you're just going to have to experiment with things until you find a paper that really works for you. The surface texture affects the rate of absorption, or the amount of absorption that happens. So watercolor paint, of course, is just water basically with some pigment inside. The way that interacts with the paper, the absorbency is very important. How quickly does the paper soak up that liquid paint? The rougher papers tend to be more absorbent. And the hot press paper, the paint sort of sits on the surface a little bit more for a longer time. As I said at the beginning, your style is important. So if you're doing very detailed style, then a hot press paper is going to work better for you. You can create small details with that smoother paper. The rough paper and the sort of cold press paper, it is more, it's not impossible, but it is much more difficult to create fine details. The hot press paper tends to give harder edges also, so more crisp edges, whereas the cold pressed and the rough, you get, well, looser, softer edges. With the rougher paper, you put the paint on, it sort of sinks into the hollows, but you get all the bumps and the raised bits in between that stay white. And I think you can see that on the screen, the right hand and the middle images. So it gives you a more sort of mottled look at the end of, once the painting has dried. So those rougher papers and the cold press papers are better, I think, for a more impressionistic approach to painting, or a looser approach, or abstract approach. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. There is a lot of information there, but I would recommend, if you're getting started, you want to do, say, landscape painting or still life painting, and it's not too detailed, you're going for something a bit more impressionistic, I would go with the cold press paper. Try that first, see what it's like, if you like it, and then once you're a bit more confident with working in watercolor, I would then try the rough paper and the hot press paper and just experiment with them and see what, whether you like them or not. If your style of painting is more like, at the beginning, the sort of botanical illustration style with lots of details, lots of hard edges, crisp edges, then I would definitely go for the hot pressed at first. You might find it adds an extra layer of challenge to the whole process. Working with hot pressed paper is a little bit more tricky, I think, than working with a cold pressed or a rough paper, but that's art. It's not a trivial thing to do. It is quite complicated and difficult, no matter what style you're doing. So it adds a bit more of a challenge to the whole thing. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching and listening. Hopefully see you again in next week's video.